All right, so I want to say a little bit more about implied premises. And I think just the best way to get implied premises down is just going to be to practice, 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 which is why we're going to spend two whole class periods on it, maybe more if you guys have trouble with it. Um, this can be tough. This is a thing I think we really need to practice. I'll say a bit about what makes it hard in this lecture. I already said a little bit in the last lecture. And it's just, I'm not going to lie to you, it is hard. But I think practice will make it a little easier, make us better at it. So we've already seen how we see when there is a missing premise, right? When there's a gap in the structure of an argument, when there's just, you know, there's a place where it seems to jump, where there's something missing, that's a good sign that there's an implied premise. Diagramming will sometimes help because we'll diagram it, we'll say, wait, we just go from 1 to 2. 2 doesn't seem to just naturally fall out of 1. We need something else there, right? We saw that with our Jefferson arguments. Implied premise always offers conjoint, or sometimes you'll hear this called dependent support. Different logic books use different language. Lavin says conjoint. Sometimes I say conjoint. Sometimes I'll say dependent because that's what you see in other logic books, with another stated premise. So, when you see an argument like this, logic is a lot like math, so you don't want to take logic. Look, 2 doesn't neatly flow from 1. Like logic is a lot like math, so you don't want to take logic. It's not obvious, right? You add an implied premise, though, and now it makes sense. Now this provides, the support that we need, right? The conjoint support. 1 and 2 together, logic is a lot like math. You don't want to take a class that's a lot like math. That might or might not be true. You might love math, you might not love math, but if you assume it is true, it now fits with 1, and the premises together justified this conclusion, right? Now look, you can also blot out 1 here and just say, you don't want to take a class that's a lot like math, so you don't want to take logic, and then it would be like, well, if I didn't know anything about logic, that 2 wouldn't tell me anything about whether I should take it or not. If logic was a lot like a poetry class, which, well, it's not, once you add 1, now that supports it. But spotting missing premises can be a little hard, but what's harder still, what really gives people a fit, and, I have to work at this myself sometimes, right? What is really difficult is once we spot a missing premise, how do we know what to fill in? What is a good missing premise? How do we fill in a missing premise to make the argument work? We see a gap, but how do we know what we should put in that gap to plug it? As Lavin says, in deductive logic, this is a bit more obvious, right? In math, if you see 7 plus x equals 12, you know what x is, right? Deductive logic is exact in the same way. If you see an argument and it's not valid, which is a bit of jargon we'll use in deductive logic, and you see what would make it valid, it's as neat as, my little simple equation there. But outside of deductive logic, and deductive logic is very useful, we'll talk about it, but it's also limited for reasons we'll talk about too. Outside of deductive logic, filling in missing premises is much more art than science. There's no exact mathematical procedure for most arguments. So what do we do? Well, that's not to say there's no rules. That's not to say you just have to know it when you see it, summon it out of thin air, right? There are a few rules of thumb. Excuse me. So the first rule, and the most important, the missing premise should fill the gap. It should actually support the conclusion when added to a stated premise in the argument or stated premises, right? And sometimes the conclusion it supports might not be the final conclusion of the argument. It might just be a conclusion that serves as a premise along the way to justify the ultimate conclusion, right? We've seen the different levels of diagramming arguments. This might not support the final level with the conclusion, but it is conjoint support with a stated premise for some claim or other. The missing premise should also be true, or at least as plausible as possible. Now, you might not know what that term exactly means. You probably don't know exactly what I mean by it because I haven't explained it, but I will in a second. And finally, and this is also super important, and in the end, this might be the most important one, the missing premise should fit with what the person actually says. Now, the problem with these rules of thumb is that they're going to be in tension sometimes. We'll talk about that in a second. That's one of the things that makes filling in missing premises difficult. So we'll talk a lot more about this in a few weeks when we talk about good premises. We'll talk about this with burden of proof and begging the question in a few weeks. But I think it's good to introduce this now, and it's good to introduce this now because we kind of have to talk about missing or implied premises, right? You should pick, when filling in missing premises, the most plausible premise that will make the argument work and actually fits with what the person says. And to say a premise is more plausible is to say that it's more likely that a person picked at random would agree with it. That's one way to think of it. You pick a person at random from somewhere in America. Let's not even assume Virginia Beach or Norfolk, just somewhere in the country, you don't know where, random American, would he agree with this or not? The more likely it is that that's true, the less controversial the premise is, right? Another way, a bit more metaphorical, you might think of this is that, I said one way to think of an argument is it's a sort of structure, a building or maybe a bit of furniture that's supposed to support our conclusion. It's a heavy object. The more controversial a premise is, the heavier it is. And now the premise needs to be strong enough to actually support the conclusion. But if it's more controversial, if it's heavier, then you have to factor its own weight into it as well, right? You don't want to add extra weight if you can help it. Anyway, I think just a few examples will make this more concrete, right? From more to less plausible, or from least to most controversial, right? Many people believe that the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy. That's just true, right? I forget the numbers, but I think it's well over 40%, right? I don't personally think it was, but, a lot of people think it was, right? It is at least possible the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy. Even somebody like me who thinks it probably wasn't, there's a good chance they might admit, well, there's some possibility, right? Probably a conspiracy. Now we're getting much more controversial. I would not admit to that, right? There's no doubt the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy. Even people who think it probably was wouldn't say, well, it's beyond a doubt, right? Or let me give you another example. It is possible that the US landed on the moon. It seems very likely that the US landed on the moon. The United States landed a man on the moon. Sorry. Possible we landed a man on the moon. Likely we landed a man on the moon. We landed a man on the moon. The United States probably didn't land a man on the moon. Finally, most controversial, in fact, almost certainly false. Moon landing was faked by Stanley Kubrick on a soundstage in Hollywood under the direction of government agents, right? Now, when we look at something that's received truth, like, that we landed on the moon, that's going to be way less controversial than some statement that most people don't believe, like the moon landing was faked, right? When you qualify a statement with stuff like very likely or possible, it becomes even less controversial, even more plausible. Even fewer people would disagree. Now, the problem is a lot of times when you qualify a premise too much, it is too weak to actually support the conclusion. So you need to strike a balance. Make it as plausible as possible, but still strong enough to actually support the conclusion, right? You know, if you know, notebook paper is very light, right? But notebook paper would not hold up a TV, right? I mean, there's no way I can think of it would, right? Particle board isn't as isn't as light as notebook paper. It can bear the weight of a TV. You know, solid steel will hold a TV too, but it's way heavier. It'll probably just fall through your floor. You know, our balance is particle board, right? Pick your premise that will support the conclusion, but is likely to be true, isn't too heavy, for using the metaphorical language, is something that another person would accept, right? When we fill in missing premises, we'll need to strike this balance. We want to give the other person a good argument. The argument needs to actually support the conclusion, but we want to try, if possible, to give them true premises, or at the very least, premises that aren't crazy, right? So I think the best way to see how this works, I've been waving my hands and being very abstract. Let's look at a few examples, and I think this will make this clear. Here's an argument. We should do away with plea bargaining since it often leads to unfair sentences. Well, what's our best candidate for a missing premise on this argument? The justice system should not have any practices that could possibly lead to unfair sentences. The justice system should do away with practices that commonly lead to unfair sentences. We should be concerned about practices that commonly lead to unfair outcomes. Plea bargaining lets some defendants get off too easy. Which of these do you think is the best and why, given what I've said? Well, look, A would actually make the argument work, right? If plea bargaining often leads to unfair sentences, and we should get rid of any practice that could possibly lead to an unfair sentence, we should definitely get rid of plea bargaining, right? But A is really, really controversial, right? Should we get rid of any practice that might lead to an unfair sentence? I mean, darn near anything you could think of might somehow lead to an unfair sentence. A is way too controversial. B, the justice system should do away with practices that commonly lead to unfair practices. Well, if we accept that plea bargaining commonly leads to unfair sentences, and we should do away with stuff that commonly lead to unfair sentences, then B makes the argument work. It's less controversial, more plausible than A, so B is a better candidate than A. Well, C is even more plausible than B, but it wouldn't make the argument work, right? The argument says we should do away with it. All C would get you is that we should be worried about it, right? C's more plausible, but it doesn't hit this sort of balance that it also makes the argument work. D is the worst of the lot, right? D seems like it's more controversial than something like B. D also really, it wouldn't even plug the gap, right? Let's look at another argument. Many textbooks, cost a lot of money, so professors should carefully consider whether to make students buy them. Professors should never make students spend extra money. Professors should carefully consider any choice that makes students spend a lot of extra money. Professors should use OER textbooks. Professors shouldn't bankrupt their students, right? A would make the argument work, but A is way more controversial than B. B would also make it work. It's less controversial than A, so it's a better choice than A. C doesn't fill the gap in the argument, so it doesn't work. D is even more controversial than B, but again, it wouldn't make the argument work, right? spending a lot of extra money isn't the same as bankrupting somebody. So B is our best choice to fill the gap. Remember, a lot of this goes back to the principle of charity that Lavin talked about. Be charitable, try to give the person a good argument. But, and we'll see this more with our practice, this creates a tension with 3, that we should try to respect what the person says. We should try to give them a good argument, but only as far as it actually fits what this person says. We cannot put words into their mouth, right? You know, if someone's making an argument and they say, well, you know, we know the world is flat, and you say, well, of course you're speaking metaphorically, right? You mean that people are just closer together than ever before. And he's like, no, I mean the world is literally a flat disk, as the Vikings said. You know, it would give him a better argument, maybe. It would be more plausible if you said that he was speaking metaphorically. But if he flat out tells you that he's a flat earther, you have to respect what this person actually says. So be charitable. Give the person the best argument possible, but you cannot put words into their mouth. All right, so hopefully that's starting to clear things up a little bit. But I think this will all become much clearer, hopefully it will anyway, once we start to practice. That's, I think, going to be the most useful for you guys.